All right, so as we go through the system here, the security module, if you guys have any questions as I'm going through it, go ahead and put those in the Q&A section of the Zoom panel. And then once I'm all done with the presentation here, I'll take those questions. I'll read the question out loud so everybody can hear the question, and then I'll go ahead and respond to that question. All right, so if you have any questions, just jot them down in the Q&A or the chat, whichever is easier for you. And then again, at the end of the session, I will go over those questions for everybody. All right, so the purpose of this webinar is to give you guys a little intro to the security module, as well as dig a little deeper in some of the things that you want to look for when you guys begin to manage your security privileges within your organizations. So I'll go through a little bit about the employee setup. We'll talk about how the permissions are set, how to create users, how to create groups, how to copy permissions from a group to another or user to another. We'll talk about the report security levels and how those are work in the system. And then we'll basically I won't go through every single permission, of course, in the essence of time, but I'll show you the different types of permissions that are in the system. So, and I think that'll make a little bit more sense once we get into it. All right. So from the start, when creating a new employee or onboarding a new employee into your system, typically the first thing you want to do is get the employee set up in the employee information module, which is called the employee setup from the main menu here. All right, once you open that module, over on the left will be a list of all your active employees, active meaning they don't have a termination date set in the system. You can use the filter bar at the top of that list to drill down. So if you type in a name and it's doing a complete search, so it doesn't have to be what it begins with, you can type in any part of the name there. It'll narrow that list down for you. If you scroll over, you'll notice you can also search by employee number. And you can see it's already defaulted to search for non-terminated employees. If you want to search for terminated employees, you can change that filter to yes. And that will give you all your terminated employees there. Right. You also have a search at the bottom of the employee setup screen. So if you go down here to the search button right in between save and list, you can click on that and it'll bring up the employee search screen. And this screen you can search by a lot more criteria. So now you have employee number, social, name, address, whether they're terminated or not. You can actually search by department or company here as well. So if you do have multiple locations, you can search for employees in a particular location. And then you can also search by employee type. So whether they're a salesperson, a finance manager, a technician, whatever the case may be, you got all those different search parameters here. So if I wanted to look for all my mechanics in company one that are not currently listed as terminated, so I'll do terminated equals no, company number equals 1, and then mechanic equals yes. That means the mechanic box is checked on their profile. And then I can either hit list or OK. OK will bring me to the first record in that results list. So you can see at the bottom it says number 1 of 36. And I can scroll through the list here. Right. And then if you want to get back to the list, you can hit the list button there, and it'll display that for you. Right. When you're setting up the employee, the pertinent information is at the top. So of course, the entity number and employee number are critical. You have to have both of those pieces of information. They should match for you, and the system will default the entity number and employee number for you when you add them. You can adjust those as long as that entity number is not already in the system. It'll allow you to change it from here. All right, name, of course. Prospect just creates a prospect profile out of this employee number, so you don't have to have one record for the employee and one record that they use when they purchase something from the dealership. And then you got the date they were hired, their address, phone numbers, location. So company number really indicates the location here. So if you have multiple locations, this is where you indicate where that employee primarily works from. Work phone, you can also put their extension in here. And if you are entering their cell phone number, you can also enter their provider. So whether it be Verizon, AT&T, whatever the case may be. This is really cool for salespeople because with that information, there's a setting in the system where you can enable that those people get text notifications when they get new leads assigned to them. All right. You also want to plug in an email address because they can also get email notifications when new leads are assigned. And then down at the bottom, you're going to indicate what department they work in, what their position is, and these are mainly for the sales and finance departments. And then in the employee pick list, you're going to check off the box that applies to what list their name needs to appear in. So if they're a mechanic, they need to be checked as a mechanic. If they're a salesperson, they need to be checked as a salesperson, and so forth. You'll notice this particular record says no security user for this employee. So this employee number is not currently tied to a security profile. And in order for them to get in and start utilizing the system, they have to have a security profile. If they're not going to use the system, or if they're just going to use the system to clock in and out, then they don't need a security profile. You can simply set them up as an employee and end the process there. All right, but if they are going to use the system in any way, shape, or form in addition to the time clock, then they have to have a security profile configured. All right, so that's what we're going to look at next. Right, so I'll minimize that. And then we'll jump into our security management system. All right, so when you open that, initially you're going to see the username, the user type, and that type is basically a user or group. The employee name, so if their record is attached to an employee file or employee number, you'll see the employee name there. Their employee number, the type of license, so either full or partial. And your partial users are typically going to be your salespeople and your technicians. For the most part, every other type of user in the system is a full user. And in the near future, we're actually going to be going away from the partial licenses, and they're just going to be one license type. And then we'll configure the security privileges accordingly to limit their access to certain things. And then you'll have their company number here, team number, cash drawer number, and then whether they're disabled or not. And you can find a disabled user by looking for the red X on their little user icon here over to the left, and that indicates that they're disabled. Disabled basically happens when you set a termination date for them in the employee module. So back in employee info, if I set a termination date here, it'll automatically mark that security profile as being disabled once I save it. So you'll get a little pop-up here. Security user Adam Reed has been disabled. Right, and then it highlights that header color in red for you. Okay, so in that list there, you got a bunch of filters here. So same thing, if you're looking for a particular user, you can type in the name there under username, or you can search by user type. So if you want to see all my groups, I can look for groups here. Employee name. All right, typically employee name and username are going to have some correlation between them, whether it's going to be first initial last name or first name dot last name, something like that. So, and then you have your employee number. And then if you want to just see all partial users, you can do that here. You can search by company number. So there's a lot of different filters and searches you can do there. Right. To create a new user, you want to go up to the top and click on that new user icon. And it's going to bring up the new user window. In that screen, you're going to enter their username. So again, that's going to be your first initial last name or first name dot last name, whatever naming convention you're using. We'll use Clegane as our example. So I'm going to do first name dot last name, or first initial last name. Let's do that. So we'll do J Clegane, and then we'll pick his employee number from here. And you can search this list. You can sort it by employee number or employee name just by clicking on a column header. So we're choosing there, and then you want to set a password. Now this password is a security password. So typically what will happen is when they log into the terminal server, the system validates their credentials based on their terminal server login, and this password here becomes not as important. if you will. So this password does become important if you guys are using our mobile application, because this is the password that the system looks for when you're signing into our mobile app. So if you are using a mobile application, you want to make sure this password matches their terminal server password. Otherwise, it does not need to match the terminal server password. If it does not match the terminal server password and you want to make them match, on every screen in the system, under the File menu, you can go to Mobile User Setup, type in that security or terminal server username and password. And then down at the bottom, just set the password for your mobile. So basically, you're going to type that same password that you typed at the top, down at the bottom twice, and then you'll hit Update Password, and that'll basically match your terminal server password to your Motility security password. All right, and then you can get in and out of the mobile apps. That basically gives you the same password throughout the system. All right. So we'll just do test 1, 2, 3. Make sure your password includes an uppercase, a lowercase, and a capital, at least one of each, or a number, sorry, at least one of each. And make sure you're not using any part of your username in your password. So if your name is James, don't put the word James in your password. All right, so then you have the license type. So whether that user is going to be a full license or a partial license. Down at the bottom, you got a couple of options. Says user cannot change password, password never expires, and then account is disabled. So this is another way you can disable that profile once you create it. All right, with that information, we'll simply hit create, and it will add that user to our list. And from that point, now we got to indicate what privileges he's going to have in the system, he or she. So once you open that profile, you have the option to set the company number, which is applicable, the cash drawer number that they'll be cashing out on if they're going to be cashing out invoices. If they're not going to cash out invoices, then cash drawer number is not necessary. Cash drawer position, team number. So team number is helpful when you have when you're using our dispatching calendar and our management dashboard. So a lot of teams or a lot of companies will set up a team number as a location. So if I got 5 locations, you know, everybody in company 1 will be team number 1, company 2 would be team 2, etc. So that's one way they do it. Another way they do it or set it up is if you do have multiple sales teams within the same company, you can set them up by sales team. So if I got 5 different sales teams in my main location, then I can do sales team number based on maybe the sales manager's name or something like that. So Josh's team, Robert's team, John's team, whatever. So it's alphanumeric. You can set it up however you want it. You just have to make sure that all the people within that team have the same team number listed here. Right. And since it is an open text box, there's some variations on how the information can be entered. So you want to make sure that they're just entering that information consistently when they do that. Right. Under member of, that's where you link this user to their applicable security group. We try to avoid putting permissions directly on the individual profile. We try to put them in the group and let those privileges get inherited from that group. So if I were to go to member of and hit add, and let's say we're going to make him a F9 manager, we'll hit add, and then I'll hit close. It'll add that group to their profile. I'll hit save. And now if we go back to general and we look at permissions, when we look at their permissions, you can see which permissions they're getting and what group those permissions are coming from. Okay. When you get down to putting permissions on individual accounts, it becomes very difficult to manage your security system, long term. The idea is that, as you rotate through employees, new people come on, people leave the company. You want to just be able to plug and play with those coming in and drop them in the applicable group based on their role there. Whereas you got people that have individual profiles or individual permissions, it's kind of difficult to plug and play new people into that role. All right, we won't get into all the permissions just yet. A couple of other things I want to show you. So that's one way to create a new user. Another method you can use to create a new user is to select an existing user, and you can right-click on that existing user. So you get a couple of options when you right-click. Add allows you to add a new user or group, and basically it's adding that new user or group with the same permissions of the user or group that you have selected. So if I wanted to add a new user that's going to have the same permissions as Lavor's, then I would hit new user here, and then it would give me that same new user screen where I can create their username, employee number, password, and then create. In that case, I don't have to go back and put them in a group because they're just going to inherit the same privileges that the person I copied basically has. Right. If I wanted to use that user's profile and create a group out of it, so let's say you had been putting individual permissions on an employee, and you gotten to the point where that employee is no longer there, so now you want to create an actual role out of what they were doing. So what you can do is go to that employee's profile and then right-click, go to add, and then create a new group based on their privileges, and then just call that group whatever you want. And let's say this was the super user group. So I can do super user and hit OK. And then that creates a new group for me that has whatever privileges that user I copied from had. Okay. Doesn't look like he had a whole lot. All right, so some other options you'll get when you right-click is copy to new user. So you can create a new profile, copying that person's permissions, copy to a new group, same thing. Copy to user, so that's copying to a user that already exists, so you're not creating a new user, you're just copying that person's permissions to another group. So if I hit copy to, then I get to choose from a list of people I want to copy their permissions to. So let's say, you know, we want Genevieve's permission to have the same privileges as Lavore, so we can hit that. All right, so if somebody's, you know, shifting roles or something like that, then that's a good way to just copy permissions or privileges from a person in that role already. All right, same thing, I can copy these permissions to a group. I can disable the account, I can reset the password, I can completely delete the account altogether, which I don't recommend. And I can also refresh, so if I've added any new permissions, I can refresh the list there. And then properties just brings you back to the properties window where you have the general and the member of sections there. Okay. So those are different ways to create new users or groups. If you want to create a new group, another method is to use the new group button at the top, and then you just give it a group name and you tell it whether it's a full or partial group. And then if you clear your filters there, it brings you back to your full list. All right. So now let's get into the permissions a little bit. All right, so if I open a user or group, we'll start with a user, and I go to the permissions tab. So again, I won't go through every single permission, but I want to show you some of the types of permissions that are in there. On the left, you'll see all the different modules of Infinity. All right, so company info, credit bureau, CRM. There's some customer-specific reportings. Those are mainly CRM reports, employee, finance, accounting, rental, etc. And within each module, there's a set of permissions or privileges that you can give someone access to or prevent someone from access. So those are the two main types of permissions: allowances and restrictions. So for example, if I were to go into parts and service, You have some group or some privileges that allow me to access certain things like advisor calendar, allowed to modify advisor settings. All right, so if I had that checked, this person is allowed to modify advisor settings on the advisor calendars. That part that you see in brackets there tells you what part of the module that permission pertains to. So a lot of the settings, let me open the module for you. So that particular permission is telling you that in the parts and service system, in the advisor calendar, which you can access from tools and go to advisor calendar, there's an advisor settings button here where we can update how many appointments that advisor can take a day, their max count, how long it takes them to schedule, and so forth. All right. To access these settings, all right, one has to have access to those settings here. All right. So that's one type of permission. The other type of permission is a restriction. All right. So this one, discounts, restricted from discounting parts. So if I have that checked, then I cannot discount parts on any type of invoice in the system. So those allowances and restrictions you want to be very careful with. Other types of permissions are permissions that say only. All right, view only, read only. Those permissions are pretty much like a restriction. They're going to limit you to only be able to view certain pieces of information, not actually edit that information. So while you can give somebody access to view and modify, you can give another person access to view only, all right, not modify. All right, other types of permissions that you'll encounter contain the word required. And you can use these filter bars at the top like I'm doing here just to narrow down those permissions. So if I look up required, all right, this one, for example, is a CRM permission, and you'll see it tells you what module each permission is for. So if I'm looking at all permissions, which I click on at the bottom here, right, it'll see all permissions, and then it tells you what module that permission is for. So if I had this one checked, advertising lead selection required before saving, that means if I'm in the CRM and I'm either adding a new entity or I'm updating an existing entity, before I can save that entity, I have to make sure I have an advertising lead selected. So just to give you the visual on that. We'll pop open our CRM and we'll just bring up a record. So advertising lead is going to be here. So if I were to have that permission checked, I would not be able to save any changes to this profile until I've selected an advertising lead. And basically, a permission like that is required or put in place to make sure that your salespeople are gathering important information so you guys can do marketing and stuff like that on your customers. All right. So allowances, restrictions, only, required are some of the permission types that you'll see in the system here. Again, look out for the fields in the brackets. Those indicate what part of the module the permission is for or where that button is located or screen is located. You'll notice a lot of these say edit menu, so that means these permissions apply to things that are in the edit menu of the parts and service module, which is here under edit, modify. So it's pertaining to all of these items. So just be mindful of that when you're going in there. Another type of permission you will see are report security levels. All right, so each module basically has a set of reports, and each of those reports has a security level 1 through 10. All right, so you'll see under different modules, parts report security level, CRM report security level, finance report security level, so forth. All right, if you can narrow it down by module here. All right. So in order for somebody to run a report for that module, they have to have two things. First, they have to be able to see that module's reports. So under the reports module, there's an actual set of permissions specifically for the reporting module. They have to be able to access that module's report. So for this case, using finance as our example, I would have to have view F&I reports. And then in addition to that, I would have to have the correct security level for the reports I need to access. All right, so in reporting, if we go to finance reports, and let's say we just wanted to run a gross profit report, all right, which is here, and let's say sales profit overview. Each of these different reports here that have the little radio buttons, each of those reports has a specific level that you need to run it. All right, so in order to access this report, we have to find out what level report that is. Okay. And that can be found in the security module under the edit menu, report security levels, filter for the module, and then you can filter for report name. So sales profit overview. And it tells you that it is currently a level 3. All right. So because that report is a level 3, if I need somebody to have access to that report, I need to make sure that person can do both things. One, under report levels, I need to make sure they can actually view F&I reports at all. And then 2, I need to make sure under finance, if you filter for report, I need to make sure they have level 3. If they don't have level 3 checked, they cannot run that report. They can have levels 1, 2, and then 4 through 10 checked, but if they don't have 3, they cannot run that report. So the security levels for the reports are not, they don't cascade down, so you can't just go in and give them a 10 and think that it's going to give them access to any report for that module. You have to give them these specific levels for the reports. So if there's somebody that should be able to see any report for that module, then you want to make sure they have levels 1 through 10 checked for that module. All right. Right. So those are different types of permissions. I always like to point out the report security levels. If you were trying to restrict someone from that report security level, then you could go into the report security level. Let's say they don't have 10 and I don't want them accessing that report. Then I can go into the edit menu, and go to report security levels, and I can make that a level 10. Now, you got to be mindful in doing that because you might affect other users. All right. So you want to be strategic in how you do this. So usually the way most clients will look at the report security levels are your levels are going to increase in importance. So for a level 1 report, it might be a basic, customer report or report that's not really going to give them any mission critical information or information that you may not want certain people to see. And then they're going to get progressively more important. So, going up to your level 10s, you may be looking at, profit analysis reports and stuff like that. Stuff that you don't want necessarily everyone to be able to view. So that's how I look at it. That's how most clients look at it. You could go the other way if you wanted to. So your 10s could be your lower importance reports down to level 1 being 1 meaning it's most important. So it just depends on how you want to set your system up. By default, the system is set up where 1 is going to be your lower level reports, 10 are going to be your high level reports. But again, they're all module specific. So, for example, in accounting, I'm going to have certain reports like my balance sheet. You can see it's a level 10, but a journal report could be a level 1. Or a vehicle chargeback report could be a level 1. So it just depends on how you want to set it and who you want to give access to those reports. Okay. Also on the users, when you go to their permissions, you can see which group, if any, they're inheriting those permissions from. So I can see that the admin user is getting all their permissions from a group called admin Trent, or most of their permissions from a group called admin Trent. If I wanted to see if that particular user is getting any permissions from outside of a group role, then I can filter here for blanks under inherits from, and it'll show me that they do have some things that they have access to that are not inherited from a group. And that's one of the things you want to try to avoid, if at all possible, is having users that are in groups or in roles, but they're still getting permissions from outside of a role. So that's something that's specific to that user. So, and I know in a lot of dealerships, a lot of people wear many hats, and you got to create, some customization and what you give them access to. But if you can at all, try to streamline it and organize it in a way that's going to allow you to expand and grow without having to do a whole lot of revamp. Okay. So now let's jump over to a report that I always like to direct people to. There is a security spreadsheet export that will give you a lot of good information if you're looking to learn more about your security, who has access to what group, certain people are in and so forth. You can run this security export spreadsheet. If you have multiple locations, you may want to run it by location. And then you can also probably want to exclude anybody that's terminated, so you're not getting terminated people on the report. You just want to look at active users. So it's going to give you a couple of things. There's 4 tabs on it. There's a groups tab, which gives you group name, and then system means module, and then description is the actual permission. So it basically tells you what permissions each group has. All right. And once you get it into Excel, you can put filters on these rows and stuff. You can narrow it down by group name or module. And then you have the employees tab that has each user, the system or module, and then what permissions they have for that system or module. If that permission is inherited from a group, it tells you what group that permission is being inherited from. Then you have employee groups, which shows you the group name, the username, and the employee name. So it basically tells you what groups the employee's in. And then the last tab you have there is the last modified date. So it tells you when each profile was last modified. So there's some type of change made to that record. They changed the permission or something to that effect. All right, so that's a pretty neat spreadsheet export to run if you're looking to get an idea where your security gaps are and where you need to make modifications. Another rule of caution I always tell people is try to avoid putting users in multiple groups if at all possible, because the more groups you're putting somebody in, the more conflict you may have with those permissions of that group. So if I got somebody in a sales group and that sales group says, restrict from discounting parts, but they're also in a parts group, so they should be able to discount parts, that restriction is going to prevail in that scenario. So try to avoid plugging people in too many groups. I would say 2 max. You just got to understand what your group roles are when you're putting people in multiple groups. If you don't have a really deep understanding of what permissions each group has, and I would suggest against putting people in multiple groups. The reason I say 2 groups, and that's mainly for our clients that have multiple locations. With those clients, we usually create a group that limits that person's access to the other locations. So we usually have a group called, let's say you got 3 locations, A, B, and C. I usually have a group called A main menu full, A main menu partial. And within that group, I'm basically telling the system that the only thing I want this group to do is limit what location they see on the main menu. So I would restrict every other location here. And actually, I'll do that on my own profile, just so I can show you. So under main menu, we'll limit those locations here, and we'll save. Another thing to take note of is when you do make changes to permissions, you have to close that module and reopen it, whatever module you made the changes for. So in this case, I made changes to our main menu, so I have to close the main menu and relaunch it. And you'll notice there that I'm not seeing all those different locations now. I'm just seeing A. All right, so that's how you can limit the location. All right, so I usually create a group for each location that handles that. What we also put in that group is their ability to run reports for those locations. So under reporting, I can limit them from running reports for the other locations or profit centers, as they're referred to in the system. So we only want them running reports and accessing items for their profit center or location. And you can basically create a group that does that and then just plug that person in that group that handles what location they have access to, and then plug them in their actual job role group that gives them access to the modules. All right, so if I created a group and I just called it A main menu full, hit create. And then we go to permissions. We'll do main menu. We're going to leave A open. We're not going to restrict them from A because that's what location they work in. We're going to restrict every other location. And then we're going to restrict their reporting for every other location. So they can't run reports for other locations either. Save, exit. And then I'll add whatever users need to be in that group. And then hit OK. All right, so that's why I say 2 at the most. Like I said, if you have multiple locations, 1 that indicates what their location, and the second one to indicate their actual job privileges, job role that they can access. All right, I think that'll conclude my portion of the presentation. So right now I'm going to look to our Q&A board and see if we have any questions. And again, I'll read those out and then I'll answer those. So got a question from Andy here. It says, what happens if you do not check anything in a module? Would the person be able to access data in it? The short answer is yes, because some privileges are restrictions and not allowances. They will inherently be able to access certain things within a module, even without having any permissions. So what you can do in those cases, if you want to prevent that, is under each module, take finance, for example, if you search for open, you can limit them from opening that module altogether. Right, so if they can't open a module, they can't access anything. But yes, if you don't have that open restriction on, they will inherently, I can't tell you exactly what for each module, but they will inherently have access to certain things, even without having any permissions. Right, because some things have to be restricted as opposed to given access to. All right, another question from Andy. When you add or delete a permission in a group, will that change it on all people who are in that group? Yes. All right, the only time that won't change all people in that group is if there was someone in that group that had a permission that was put on their individual profile. All right, and that's another reason you don't want to put permissions on individual profiles, because you put it on their profile and then you add them to a group that has it. If you remove them from that group or change that permission in that group, it's not going to affect that person because it was already on their individual profile. Another thing you want to be mindful of, kind of along the same lines, is when you are copying group permissions, it's going to copy the users in that group as well. So if you don't want every user in that group to have those permissions, after you do your copy, you want to go back to that group and take out the people that you don't want this to affect, that copy to affect. Right, so those are the only 2 questions I see so far, but I'll leave the floor open there if anybody else has any questions. Alrighty, I don't see any additional questions popping up, and it looks like some people are starting to drop off the webinar, so I'll go ahead and end it there. If you guys do have additional questions about your account specifically, then you can always reach out to your account managers, and they can get you in touch with our professional services team here that can help you with those questions that you may have. This webinar has also been recorded, so if you have anyone who was planning on attending and didn't get a chance to for whatever reason, these recordings will be available on our website, maybe this week or early next week. As soon as the recording is done rendering, I'll get it over to our marketing team and get them to publish that on our website for you. So it's going to be under our support center and then video library. You'll be able to find those videos there, and you can always go back and rewatch it. All right, but if there will be no more questions at the moment, I will go ahead and conclude the webinar. Thank you guys for attending. Thanks for your attentiveness. Thanks for the questions. Those are good questions, and I hope you had some information presented to you here today that's going to help you make some changes for the better in your installations and your organizations. And again, if you need help, we here at Motility are always available for you, and we'd be happy to work with you.